It's Zachary, and I'm here to talk to you today about photography. So I'm going to do a three-part video series on photography as part of our socially distant science and adventure video series here. And first, we're going to start with the fundamentals of photography, basically the fundamentals of exposure and how we make a correct image on a camera's film or sensor. Okay, so photography is the art of writing with light. What you're trying to do is measure the amount of light that hits your sensor or your film, whatever your medium is. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to imagine that most of you are working with digital media like digital cameras, so I'm going to probably say sensor more often. Look at it a couple of different ways, okay? There's three different primary variables that we can use to determine how much light actually hits that sensor. Depending on how much light hits the sensor, it can either be overexposed or underexposed. Overexposed means there's way too much light. We've all seen an overexposed photo. This is something that's completely bleached out. It's mostly white. It just doesn't look natural and normal. It looks weird. Underexposed is when everything is way too dark. Underexposed and overexposed, we are trying to find that perfect exposure, and then of course you have a little bit of latitude on either end for artistic expression, and we'll get into that kind of in the masterclass section later on. But what you're dealing with is these three primary variables: the speed of your shutter, the width of your aperture, how much light we let in, how big is the opening, and then the ISO, which is the sensitivity of our media or our sensor. So if you affect any one of those, you have to affect the others as well in order to keep that same exposure. So there's a lot of resources about this online, and I'm going to put up a couple of graphics, maybe some links in the description here that you can go to kind of pull up a chart or something. But if you do not really know how to use your camera manually, really all of it is manipulating those three variables. So first of all, let's go with ISO. Back in the days of film, you could only have one ISO. You picked your film, and you probably heard of film speed, right? So you have like ISO 100 speed film, ISO 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200. It doubles each time. And then it also goes down too. There's ISO 50, there was ISO 25. Many of the most famous photographs that you've ever seen are like Steve McCurry National Geographic photos that were shot on Kodachrome, and those were slide film shots that were taken at like ISO 25 or 64 and some weird numbers in there. What we want to do is focus first on our ISO. Now, in a digital camera, you have the ability to vary your ISO wildly. Some cameras will start at ISO 50 or 100, and they'll go all the way up to, in the case of very advanced cameras, 50,000, 100,000 ISO. I mean, really, really high numbers, way up there. When you introduce higher ISO, you would just say, well, why don't we always go to an extremely high ISO? Because that's going to give us the ability to shoot in lower light. The higher the number, the more sensitive the film. So or the sensor, that is. So if it's set at ISO 100, like on a sunny day like this, that's going to be about right. You set it at ISO 100 on your digital camera, or you use a daylight film. You may have heard, if you've been familiar with photography for a long time, daylight speed film. So that's a lower ISO number. The lower the ISO, the less sensitive it is to light, which means it needs a longer exposure time. It needs more time to be exposed, or it needs a wider iris, a wider aperture to get that light in order to make a proper exposure. When the number gets higher, you would think, well, that would be a good thing because we can speed up our shutter and we can close down our iris. We don't have to be pushed right to those maximums. I'll get to that in a second. But there's a sacrifice that you make. When you go to a higher ISO number, you are usually introducing grain on film or noise on a digital camera, and your images get less sharp, they look a little fuzzy, and they're not so great. So depending on the quality of your camera, some cameras can shoot very high quality up to higher ISO numbers and extremely high ISO numbers. A lot of your consumer grade cameras, your iPhones, things like that too, which can take good photos, but they need good light. They don't perform particularly well in low light or in high ISO situations. Okay. So what we want to do is let's put together a scenario. Right now in this bright sunlight, I'd probably set my ISO to 100, basically base ISO for my camera that I use for landscape and wildlife photography, which is a Nikon, and actually we're filming on it as we speak. So I have my ISO set at 100. Let's just for a minute say that we can't vary it, and we're going to set that at 100 speed. Now, with it being extremely bright outside, we're going to want to have a relatively short shutter life, short shutter speed, and an iris that's going to be somewhat closed down. Now, let's talk about that, okay? Aperture. Aperture is the size of the hole that's inside your lens that the light is coming through. So imagine a bucket of water. This is the analogy that's frequently used. You've got a bucket of water and we put a pinhole in the bottom of it, and then we throw a gallon of water in there and we hold it. How long is it going to take for all of that water to drain out? It's going to take a while, right? It's going to be a thin little stream of water. Now, if I punch a baseball-sized hole in the bottom of it and I pour my water in, how quickly is the water going to drain out? Shoof, really fast. So the bigger the aperture, then the faster the light goes through, or the more light goes through, I should say, in any given second, meaning that the life of the shutter speed can be shorter. So why would we want a shorter shutter speed? I'll get to that in a second. Now, when you're looking at your aperture, why wouldn't you just set a basic aperture and shoot that way all the time? Well, it's for artistic expression or in low light or high light situations. Now, here's the confusing part about aperture. The lower the number, the bigger the opening. So on a lot of lenses, you're going to end up with a widest aperture of about f2.8, and we don't need to get into like why it's called that, but f2.8, it's your f-stop of your lens. All light and cameras and photography is expressed in stops, so one jump, and they're all equal. So a jump in aperture is equivalent to a jump in shutter speed and a jump in ISO. So when I describe the difference between ISO 100 and 200, that's a stop. 200 and 400, it doubles again, is a stop. It's always a doubling. Same thing with shutter speed. So with shutter speed, you might have a 250th of a second. The next jump up, another stop, is a 500th of a second, then a 1,000th, then a 2,000th of a second, a 4,000th of a second, and an 8,000th of a second, if you can believe it. So it always doubles, and that's another stop of light. Half as much light in each situation. It's just having it down, stopping it down. So what you end up with in aperture is this weird set of numbers, and it has to do with the width of the iris and all that. So we don't need to get into that, but you start at, let's say, f2.8, then you jump up to f4, f5.6, f8, you know, and so on. You end up with f16, f22, f11. There's all these crazy numbers in there. So a lot of lenses are going to go from, let's say, f2.8 up to f16 or 22. All right, that's a kind of a range that you're normally going to get. More expensive lenses might have a really wide open aperture, and you can shoot at like f0.95, which is an extraordinary amount of light, and very expensive lenses might have that capability. Leica makes one called the Noctovid. It's a $10,000 lens that's about that big, and it lets in that much light. There's actually one for Nikon too. It's about $7,000, manual focus only. So it's incredible, but it's not something you would ever really use normally. A lot of times those lenses are called Noct lenses, so nighttime lenses. And why is that? Why is it a nighttime lens, or why is it a dark circumstance lens? Because that aperture opens up really wide, which means more light comes in, which means that your shutter speeds can be reasonable, okay, like short enough that that they can freeze motion. So that's your aperture. Aperture is the size of the opening. ISO is the sensitivity of that media behind the opening. So now we have that. So let's say that right now under these conditions, we're going to set our aperture at f8 and our ISO at 100, ISO 100. So now we know how big the opening is and how sensitive the film is. Now if we just shoot randomly at any different shutter speed, okay, then we can underexpose or overexpose. A proper exposure for f8 at 100 speed right now, you know, could be something like 125th of a second or a 250th of a second, whatever that might be. Anything slower than that is going to result in an overexposure. Now, when your shutter speed is slower, that means that it's longer, meaning the shutter is open for a longer period of time. So you can imagine a 1 second aperture, or I'm sorry, 1 second shutter speed would look like this. Click, 1/1000, click, and it shuts. A 2,000th of a second would be, you know, it's so fast you can't even see it. Now, when that opens up for that short amount of time, a certain amount of light gets in. And of course, it's controlled again by how big the opening is, and then the final image results as a result of how sensitive the media, the sensor is. So that's basically what you have going on. Shutter speed, you can vary it. Aperture, you can set it. You can also vary that. ISO, you can vary it. A lot of cameras come with what's called Aperture Priority, where you set the shutter speed on automatic. So if you have an A on the top of your camera, you can set it at Aperture Priority, and that's going to automatically determine a shutter speed without you having to think about it, based on what aperture you set and how sensitive the media is. So how sensitive your ISO is. So for instance, you could say I'm going to do my 100 on my ISO, I'm going to do f2.8 for my aperture, and then I'm just going to let the camera determine how fast the shutter needs to be based on what it determines in its light meter. Cameras have a light meter built in. Modern cameras have a light meter built in. So if you point it at a sunny, bright wall, it's going to make that shutter speed faster because you've got a lot of light coming in. So it's going to make it quicker so that the opening is only open for a very short amount of time in order to get a proper exposure. If I then point it at my garage into the dark, the shutter speed is going to have to be longer. Now you can really get advanced with some cameras, and you can set like a minimum and a maximum because you don't want it to get too slow. Why would we not want the shutter speed to get too slow? Most cameras can go down to, even like a 30-minute exposure using a setting called bulb or setting a timer on it. But in order to freeze motion, so to freeze motion blur, you want about 125th of a second, a 60th of a second maybe if your subject is relatively still. Anything slower than that is going to introduce motion blur. So if I'm talking and you take a photograph of me at, let's say, a quarter of a second, my mouth is going to be all blurry because it's moving while the shutter is open. It's not able to freeze that action. 125th of a second and faster, it's probably going to freeze it. A safe bet is 125th, 250th of a second, that kind of thing for your shutter speed. Now, if you're using Aperture Priority, the camera's going to set that for you. You don't need to worry about it. But in totally manual photography, you're going to be able to set this. Now, a camera's going to have a light meter too, so if you're doing everything manually, you're setting your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed, there's usually going to be a bar, and in the middle is your proper exposure, and it's going to show a little icon moving back and forth if it's over or underexposed, or I suppose to you, over and underexposed. But if it's overexposed, the little arrow will be to the right or above or something like that. It'll say plus maybe or minus. You want to try to get that in the middle if you're looking for a proper exposure, a correct exposure. You'll hear it referred to. So those variables go into determining exactly what kind of an exposure you're going to get taking still photos on a film camera or an analog camera or a digital camera, depending on your sensitivity. So there's a couple things that we need to think about here. With aperture, if we're setting the aperture manually and the shutter speed is doing it automatically or whatever, it doesn't matter if we're setting that shutter speed manually or if the camera is doing it itself. When we open our aperture up wide, so remember, wide aperture is a low number, and that's the biggest opening. So let's say that our lens is a f2.8 to f22 lens. So f2.8 is as wide as it goes. When we use a wider aperture, it's going to result in a shallower depth of field. And what's depth of field? It's what's in focus. So if you are really close, it might be out of focus. If you're right at the correct focal plane where the camera is focusing, it would be in focus. And if you're back here, it might be out of focus. Your depth of field is narrower with a wider aperture. So wider aperture, shallower depth of field. So that means that things in the foreground are out of focus, things in the background are out of focus. This is how you get those beautiful images of like a bird in a tree where the background is all blurred out and it looks very professional, and you've got razor sharp focus on the bird. It's going to draw your eye to the bird or the branch he's on. It's going to draw your eye in because that's what's in focus. How do we do that selective focus? It's with a wide aperture. The wider your aperture, the shallower your depth of field, more bokeh or bokeh, which is that blurred out effect in the foreground and the background, especially in the background behind a subject. So a portrait photographer is often going to shoot wide open or near wide open in order to achieve that background blur to focus the attention on the subject. That's what we want. Now in landscape photography, which we'll talk about more extensively, you want a very deep depth of field because you want everything in focus. What would a landscape photo of mountains be if the mountains were blurry and the foreground of the moss on the lichens and all that stuff was blurry and a few rocks in the middle or the lake was the only thing in focus? You could selectively do that, but chances are you're not going to want to do that. Chances are you're going to want everything to be sharp. right? That's what we want. So a deep depth of field. In order to get a deep depth of field, what do we have to do? You close down the aperture. So let's say we're all the way down to f11 or f16. What's that going to do? It makes that aperture really, really tiny. So we either have to up the sensitivity of our film, but we don't necessarily want to do that, do we? Because we don't want to introduce grain. What we want to do is introduce a nice, smooth, beautiful photo. So the lower the ISO number, the better the grain characteristics and the film characteristic of the final image. It's going to be cleaner and look prettier, be a lot nicer. So we want a low ISO number and we want a small aperture. What does that mean? That means that we need a long shutter speed, potentially, which is where tripods come in. So you put your camera on a tripod, you set a timer, and there you go. That's how you're going to get a proper exposure on something where you want a deep depth of field. Now with wildlife or a portrait where you want a very shallow depth of field, you want to isolate the subject, whatever you're focusing on, and the foreground and the background are out of focus, we're lucky because you can usually do that handheld because you're going to have a very fast shutter speed because your aperture is going to be open up wide. So you open your aperture up really, really wide, let's say f2.8, focus on your subject, and boom, it's probably going to be overexposed unless you speed up that shutter. So if we use auto shutter speed, it's going to jack that shutter speed way up, 2,000th, 4,000th of a second. I've shot birds and trees at a 4,000th of a second, 1/4,000th of a second at f2.8 all day long, you know, when it's bright and sunny outside. So that's how it's usually going to work. So fast shutter speed means you're freezing the subject. Slow shutter speed maybe means you're introducing blur, which is actually an artistic thing you might want to do sometimes. You might want blurry photos to impart action and intensity in a photo. But really, usually you're going to want to freeze photos. That's what photography is. You're freezing that light. You're drawing with the camera. So 125th of a second or faster. But you can see how each of those things of what we call the exposure triangle affects one another. So you can set your camera on auto and it's going to do all these things for you. It's usually going to select something like f8 because it wants a reasonably deep depth of field to get as much as it can in focus. It's going to set as low of an ISO number as it's allowed to with the light characteristics, so what's going on, and it's going to try to set a shutter speed of a 60th of a second or faster so that it freezes the action. That's probably going to work and get a proper exposure, but it might just be a boring photograph where everything is kind of in focus and the light is relatively flat, the action is frozen, etc. But you can expose totally differently based on your own, artistic characteristics and what you're looking at. So really, really quick again, the subject is shut down the iris. That's going to give you the aperture. It's going to give you less light. Open it up wide, a low number, f2.8, f1.4. That's going to be super wide aperture. Lots of light gets in. So that means you're going to need fast shutter speeds or slow shutter speeds with a small iris, or your ISO can adapt, but we always want to go for that lowest ISO. So I hope that this was helpful. There's going to be some links down in the description to some tables that you can look at that's going to explain this a little bit further with some graphics. And anyway, this is hopefully going to be something that allows you to now move forward in your own photography. The next one is going to be landscape photography, where we're going to use, what are we going to use? We're going to use probably a small aperture so we get a deep depth of field. We're going to use a tripod because we're going to need slow shutter speeds, and we're going to use very low ISO because we want it to be clean. But we're also going to get into filters and composition and some of the artistic decisions that I make when I'm taking a landscape photo. And then on the other end of the spectrum is wildlife photography, where we're going to use very fast shutter speeds because we're going to be blown wide open with our aperture out in bright sunlight conditions. So that's going to give us that blurry background effect. And that's going to give us the ability to isolate that subject. So I hope that this helps. And okay, this was photography 1. Next, we're going to see you. We're going to talk about landscape photography. Talk soon. Bye.